So today I won't be talking about this brigade per se. I'm going to be talking about Huntsville and the Huntsville Penitentiary Textile Mill. Right here in beautiful Huntsville, Texas, which is where the penitentiary mill was during the war. The humble penitentiary mill, forgotten, misunderstood, but vitally important for Texas and the Trans-Mississippi during the Civil War. So what did Huntsville do? Well, this story is going to tell you a little bit about what Huntsville did for the war. The Huntsville Penitentiary Mill was the backbone of the textile industry in the Trans-Mississippi. It was one of the largest textile mills west of Georgia, and these are some of the insights that I want to share. I want to talk about the mill's origin and its place within the antebellum Texas economy, talk about its products and contributions to both the Confederate Army and the citizenry, and speak very briefly about its legacy to the industrialization of Texas and the South. Before I go further, I want to say that I owe Michael Rubley Moore a great debt of gratitude for his groundbreaking thesis on the penitentiary mill, and it's based on that thesis he did back in 1982 at the University of Texas. But historians like me have been able to take this information and then bring that further into different facets of history. So, where did the penitentiary mill come from? So, it's interesting. In the 19th century, there was a belief that you could take criminal convicts and you could rehabilitate them. You could build penitentiaries and you could rehabilitate these people and make them valued, productive members of society if you gave them a skill. So throughout the country, not just Texas, but throughout the country and throughout the South, from Maryland and Virginia and on westwards, ever westwards, out to Texas, each state built penitentiaries, but these were conservative, fiscally minded people. And so each penitentiary had a mill because that penitentiary was going to pay for itself and those prisoners were going to work and learn trade. So why would they, not make shoes or raise cattle or something? Why did they have a penitentiary then? Why is they all build penitentiary mills? That comes to the next point. Because in the South, there was a dream with Southern leaders to make the South economically and politically independent. And they saw a realization that they grew cotton, but they had to have it milled in the North or in Europe. And their vision was, from almost the beginning of the 19th century, we want to build our own mills, mill our own cotton into yarn and cloth, and make ourselves, how to industrialize ourselves. And this was the movement of the South up to the Civil War. And it's my opinion that it's one reason that we've threatened the North so much, because we were industrializing and the deuce that laid building egg was about to fly. But we weren't there yet. I mean, the South had a very small population compared to the North and Europe. And so industrialization was a very difficult thing. But that's why every state had a penitentiary and a penitentiary mill. And so in about 1850, Texas finally chartered its penitentiary mill, and construction began in 1854 on the mill, And by 1856, the mill was up and running, producing textiles used in Texas and using prison labor. So let's talk just briefly about what they were making. The products were common woolen goods, mainly, cheaply, coarse, lightweight, plain weave, Osnaburgs, and then the separate product was a heavyweight quill cotton jeans. It was called Texas jeans when it was made there in Huntsville. And then lastly, they produced woolen cloth, like outer garments, clothing. It's mostly a twill weave, some plain weave, for those who are, into or reading thing and know what that is. So what was the customer base? Well, before the Civil War, the customer base was the plantation. They bought almost all of the penitentiary textiles. They use the textiles for clothing, but they use the Osnaburg for lightweight cottons, not just for shirts and boards, things like that. They use them actually more for bagging. And for those who are familiar with the cotton industry, back then they need bagging and ropes, bag their cotton. So a lot of the cottons were used for bagging. So that was your chief customer before the war. Now, before I go, start on the war, let's continue with the antebellum Texas economy. And a brief overview of Texas in the 1850s. For one day, in 1860, Texas was, as far as population goes, a very small state. The big states were Virginia, North Carolina, the Empire State of the South, Georgia, even Tennessee. These were the big states. Of all the southern states at 1860, the time of secession, Texas, which is now this big mighty state with this huge population, at that time it was the third from the smallest state in the Confederacy. Had a population of 604,000. Maybe a third of those were white, slate. Behind Texas was Arkansas. I think it had even a higher percentage of slave. And then the least populous southern state was Florida, which most people don't know, but it was basically a howling wilderness, and everything south of Jacksonville was cattle and the cow industry. And so anyway, Texas was, as far as population goes, it was a small state. And so what did this mean? It was a small state. But what it meant was it's really hard to foster industry when you have a small population and you don't have that surplus population with artisans, mechanics, and people in the technical fields. It's not what it was today, but that small population would have an impact. And see, let me get that. This is a Texas farm. So anyhow, let's talk about the Texas economy. So what is ingrained in the psyche for today when we think of Texas is Texas longhorn and cattle industry? And that industry really didn't come to full fruition until after the Civil War. Now, they had it before the Civil War, but incredibly enough, they didn't drive cattle north, but they drove them east over Sabine, through South Louisiana up to New Orleans, and then shipped the cattle north up the Mississippi, or they continued them over the Mississippi River and drove them on to Mobile. So those are the cattle drives. Kind of neat, little piece of history. But the cattle industry really didn't define Texas, but they had a lot of cattle there. A lot of leather for Civil War industry. The thing that really defined the Texas economy more than anything was cotton. Yes, they had sugar, but cotton was key. And so it really defined the Texas economy. But there's something else that defines the Texas economy then that is almost forgotten nowadays. I mean, no one knows about it, the common person knows. Texas was one of the South's largest wool baskets. So, of course, it was a major supplier of wool for Texas South. Now, where did Texas stand as far as wool production and sheep production went? Okay, so here's some quick statistics. Texas ranked fourth in production in the South behind Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, and fifth in production of numbers of sheep behind Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, and Tennessee. Right there, I gave a big clue to anyone who's really good at Civil War history. Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee, they all were captured by the spring of 1862. They fell away as wool-producing regions for the South, which catapulted Texas into the number 2 position as the South's wool basket. So now Texas is just important. For instance, we have at the beginning of the Civil War, Quartermaster General Abraham C. Myers realized this, and he sought to ship as much Texas wool to the rest of the Confederacy as he could. In 1864, Penitentiary Mill's financial agent, Samuel B. Hendricks, wrote this in January 64. He said that the region around Huntsville was one of the South's largest wool-producing areas. In a wool-growing country, where wool is cheaper and more abundant than anywhere else in the Confederacy. So, what was this about the wool? Okay, so East Texas was a wool-producing area. Huntsville, a wool-producing area, all around East Texas. And they grew the superior merino sheep. Superior as a sheep because it had a long, staple, good fiber. And the longer the staple, the better the wool for spinning. Down in southwest Texas, I guess what we would call the valley today, kind of southwest of San Antonio, that area, they also bred sheep, but that was considered the inferior Spanish sheep because the fleece was much coarser and had a shorter staple. So it was more difficult to spin the yarns and all that. But anyway, it did have 2 wool-producing regions. So this would supply all this cotton and all this wool was a tremendous resource for Texas and Trans-Mississippi during the Civil War, along with all the longhorn cattle that supplied leather. What else? So now let's get back to the Penitentiary Mill very briefly. Something important that we need to keep in mind, because sometimes we forget this today. We think of things as Confederate or federal government runs things. The Penitentiary Mill was state-owned, and while during the Civil War it would sell its products to the Confederacy, it was never owned, managed, or operated by Confederate authorities. That too would have an impact, as we'll hear. So we're getting closer to the Civil War. We're like in 1860, 1861. And I'll talk just very briefly about the products of the mill. About 85% of all the fabrics that they produce at the mill were cottons. Almost all were cotton osnaburgs that were, the lightweight stuff used for bagging and underclothing, that kind of thing. These were 28 inches wide. They were called cedar-lip fabrics. Why would I even mention this? That who cares? The dolls know anything about cedar-lip fabric? Well, the thing is, during the Civil War, all of the imported fabrics were double width, so they were twice as wide. So what that meant is that these domestically produced textiles, the single width, you can only make half the clothing or half the products with like Huntsville Penitentiary Mill stuff as you could with imported stuff. So for instance, the typical Confederate imported British Confederate grade woolen cloth, you needed 3 yards of that to make a jacket, a pair of trousers, a pant. But with the Huntsville Penitentiary single width goods, woolen kersey or Texas cotton jeans, you needed 6 yards to make the cap, the jacket, pant. So we're not talking about that, just keep it in mind, there was a huge quantitative difference. But anyway, and for what it's worth, here's some, pictures as best as I could get of original fabrics of the time, if it shows up well. So just, okay, and then, let's see, where are we here? Okay, and so again, just mentioning this, about 85% of the mill's production was cotton fabrics. I mentioned the cotton, the osnabers, also called lowels, and they were used chiefly for shirts, drawers, lighter weight garments like that, haversacks, and cotton bagging. The cotton twill jeans, that was the heavier cotton cloth and made with a tougher twill weave. That was used mainly for outer garments, such as jackets and pants, but also for chintz, wagon coverage, heavy duty stuff. And both the osnabers and the cotton jeans, the Texas jeans, they were all kind of mildly bleached or washed maybe, but they were left white, so they weren't dyed. And lastly, we have the woolen fabrics made by the Penitentiary Mill, almost exclusively a twill weave kersey. Sometimes they make a simpler plain weave. And there were 3 colors that this came in. Almost the vast majority was made in bleached white. Then they made some brown, early war, brown dyed woolen fabrics, and then they also made kind of a natural sheet spray. And what I've done here is, so I've taken some pictures of Confederate fabrics, the better original. One's kind of an unbleached white, it kind of looks yellow up in the picture, but I think it's the best I could get. And then the next is like a brown dye fabric. So that's about what the fabrics would have looked like at the time. About the dyeing and the colors of the fabric in wartime, an economic consideration. Prior to the Civil War, and for the first year of the Civil War, the woolen fabrics, like for the uniforms, they were all delivered in the brown color. What the mill did is spun the yarn, cleaned the yarn, and then put the yarn on what they called stains. So those are big giant loops of yarn, and then these are dipped into a brown dye, and then those yarns are woven in cloth, which made brown cloth. And so how did they do that? Well, they had the South American wood called logwood, and they rendered that into a brown dye. But for those familiar with the dyeing process, you needed a mordant to kind of hold the dye color on the fibers of a wool. And so they use copperas. And maybe some of you are at Copper Stove, Texas. Okay, so yeah, that's where they got like copperas as a word. So anyhow, and so they that's how they made the dyed fabric. And after the war commenced, they realized, this is costing too much time and money, and so they kind of backed off of dyeing the yarns, and they just went with the white cloth. But I also mentioned the sheep's gray. So let me see if my next are. Okay, so another thing that they tried to do that would render a gray fabric for the uniforms, but without dyeing, they had a natural sheep's gray. So the one picture of the cloth that you could see on y'all's right, that's original Confederate cloth in sheep's gray, undyed sheep's gray. And then the next picture shows the sheep's fleece, so you have some perspective on, how they came up with this idea of sheep's gray. And so you have one of the wool workers parting the fleece, and you can see the brilliant, clean white fleece underneath, but the outside kind of dirty gray. And so what they do is they would try to wash some of the lanolin out of that, but then weave all that grayness into the yarns. So that's where we get that idea of sheep's gray. But that idea didn't really work well, so they didn't like doing that on Huntsville. So we're in the war, and the wartime sales really reprioritize things. So the first priority now went to the military. The military was to have first priority for the Huntsville products. And in 1861, all of Huntsville's production went to the military. Now, that really had to work because you don't just have a military, you have a civilian base there, and they need cloth too. Where are they going to get it? They can't really import it in the war. It's just not going to work. So by 1862, they started to allow citizens, they started to allow citizens to purchase the Huntsville goods. But these were individual purchases, and the citizens were not to resell. In other words, non-speculative sales. And the sales were supposed to be prioritized for citizen families who had soldiers in the military, who had family members in the military. Also, beneficiaries would buy these products. So like someone would buy a lot of these penitentiary fabrics and then make them for a company or a regiment of soldiers. So it was still kind of geared toward the military. And the plantation owners could still buy products from the bill that they got the last borrowing now because the military and the soldiers' families came ahead. The next category of customer, now remember this is all revenue for Texas. This is important to Texas to get revenue. So the next big customer were these larger customers. The biggest was the state of Tennessee. So the state of Tennessee in 1861, which is interesting to me, Tennessee and Arkansas were the first Confederate states to operate real efficient quartermaster depots. Not Virginia, not Georgia. It was Tennessee and Arkansas. And so the state of Tennessee contracted with the state of Texas for its products. And let's see, accordingly, Irby Morgan, the purchasing agent for Tennessee, he had the right to half of the production of the Huntsville factory for 6 months, starting 1 November 1861 to 1 May 1862. And while the records are somewhat incomplete, he got at least 11,000 yards of woolen cloth, 25,000 yards of cotton jeans, 40,000 yards of Ostervards, probably much more, as well as 450,000 pounds of wool from Texas and some other southern sources, which were then taken to Tennessee and elsewhere and turned into cloth that yielded 500,000 yards of gray cloth. So that was one of the big customers. We'll talk about a couple more. So Texas Governor Francis Lubbock, he got a lot of blowback about Tennessee getting the Huntsville products because by the spring of 1862, the Huntsville Mill was really the only game of town in the Trans-Mississippi. Baton Rouge and their mill had been captured. The huge industrial complex of New Orleans with its factories and its textile mills, it had been captured. All that was left was Huntsville. So Francis Lubbock got a lot of blowback from Texas citizens. We don't want you selling any more Huntsville products to the state of Tennessee. So on April 30th, 1862, he allowed the contract to lapse, and that ended that project. And thereafter, Texas tried as best it could under the circumstances to limit their products to going to Texas troops. They never really did that, but they did limit their products going to Trans-Mississippi troops, mostly Texans, and also to the families of Confederate soldiers. Thereafter, the Confederate quartermaster received most of the mill's production, getting 3/4 of the woolens and over half of cotton products, pretty much for the rest of the war. And this continued almost to the end. We'll talk about that later. But between December 1861 and May 1862, the Trans-Mississippi quartermaster, Chief J.F. Miller, he received 35,000 yards of woolens, 12,000 yards of cotton jeans, and 69,000 yards of Osnaburgs. And this was sent to Little Rock to be turned into clothing because the Little Rock Penitentiary had expanded into a factory complex that made Confederate war material. So in addition to the Confederate quartermaster sales, which were the main sales, there were sales to Texas citizens who had family in the Army. And these families could buy products at reduced prices. In November of 1864, there had been so many casualties due to the war, so many widows, so many families kind of going on their own devices, that the Texas government enacted a law, the state legislature, that they would allot 600,000 yards of cotton goods annually to be distributed at no cost to indigent families of Confederate soldiers. A little bit late in the war, but in the between November of 1864 and the end of the war, the state managed to distribute 100,000 yards. So they got a good start. Their heart was in the right place. Finally, clothing contractors in the Trans-Mississippi, in Texas, received cloth to make into uniforms, but they were, sanctioned. So they were making a profit for for make clothing, but it was in support of the war effort. And some of the cloth was going to these new Confederate clothing depots that were springing up, like Captain E.C. Wharton's depot in Houston, Texas. So he was getting some of this Huntsville goods for stuff like, as he says, Osterbergs for shirts, drawers, linings, haversacks, knapsacks, and tents. And the contractors were getting the same thing. The largest of those was James P. Spring, and we'll talk about him momentarily. So, as was mentioned, the penitentiary mill was state-owned and operated, and the state of Texas took in the revenue from the mill. The way they did that was they had penitentiary financial agents who were supposed to manage the financial affairs of the mill. And the first of these during the war was a man named M.C. Rogers. He managed the mill of the financial affairs from February 1860 to early 1863. He had to be replaced in early 1863 by the very efficient but abrasive John S. Besser, who actually had held the assignment since 1852 to 1860, but who was let go because of his acerbic nature. This would come back. Rogers was a well-liked man. He was good with people, but he was a poor manager, and due to his ineptitude, he put the penitentiary over $42,000 in arrears, and this upset the governor's office because the governor's office relied heavily on the mill for revenue. And you got this chucklehead, he was losing money all the time. So they did something that they were very antsy about doing. They brought John S. Besser back, the previous financial agent, and true to form, within 10 months, John S. Besser had started to turn a profit. He had put all the books back in the black. He had righted the ship of state, and he had managed to anger nearly everyone in the state. The man, his business acumen just contrasted with his utter lack of diplomacy. He was utterly tactless in the way he dealt with people. And moreover, he always gave an air of impropriety. And so I will give an example of this. He hired his underage for the Army son, like his son was maybe 17 years old, couldn't go on beyond. He hired him as a clerk, with a high-paid position. The son was competent, but it gave the appearance of favoritism. And of course, the problem was that Besser could hardly hire clerks because they were draft exempt. So, in his mind, he was doing the smart thing. In the way people saw that, he was showing favoritism. Besser lasted till December 1863, when a group of Texas state troops, not known for their refinement or discipline, marched into his office and demanded enough Huntsville Penitentiary goods to make 30 pairs of trousers for their command. Besser explained to them that they had to file a requisition for the goods through their local command, the Texas State Troops, Captain E.W. Taylor in Houston, Texas, and just as soon as Captain Taylor would give them the requisition, they could have their cloth. Now, the problem actually was that Besser probably didn't explain that to them in quite as even and level-handed a manner as I just explained it. He explained it in a manner that brought the following response. The Texas State troops drew their guns, threatened to shoot Kim. He reached for his rifle, and then the Texas State troops started aiming away at Kim and his family in the office. The family fled to upper stories. He fled some other place. The Texas State troops took exactly what they wanted and more and left. And this incident so under Besser that he resigned within days. So now they needed a new financial agent. And they brought in Samuel B. Hendricks. And he was definitely a better fit. He was an able administrator and also a very tactful gentleman. And he was described as follows, direct quote, ever sociable and obliging. Even the women like him. He refuses their many impossible requests so courteously. So, the right man for the job. He also raised the prices of Huntsville products of penitentiary cloth to raise revenue, but still kept the prices cheaper than any other cloth that the Army was buying. So he had a good business head, chick. Wartime production. So the Huntsville Mill manufactured over 7 million yards of single-width cloth during the war of all types, osnaburgs, cotton jeans, woolen jerseys, and woolen planks. As said, Tottenham's accounted for about 85% of the mill's production. And financial agent John Besser reported that, let's see, what year was that? Oh, from December 1861 to December 1863, the mill had manufactured approximately 1.4 million yards of cotton goods and 293,000 yards of woolens for the Confederate military. Another report states that the various military organizations, Texas State and Confederate, between June of 1861 and February of 1865, so for almost the entire war we're talking about, they received about 450,000 yards of woolens, 600,000 yards of cotton jeans, and 1.4 billion yards of osnaburgs. And it just calculating that, my own calculations, that would have sufficed for 82,000 woolen uniforms, caps, jackets, and pants, or 92,000 cotton jeans, even blush. Major Haynes, who in 1863 became the chief of clothing bureau for the department, he received from March through December of 1863, so in 1 year, 110,000 yards of white woolen jerseys, 110,000 yards of cotton jeans, and 400,000 yards of osnaburg. So that was for the Confederate side. Nonetheless, with all this production, the mill still couldn't provide all the cloth needed to clothe the people in the Trans-Mississippi or the military. And even with getting, most of the woolen production and about half the cotton production, it just couldn't suffice for the military. And as I mentioned, the mill was a state-run organization. They got the money, they ran the organization, and in February of 1865, right at the end of the war, they told the Confederacy, we are now selling on a cash basis, no more credit in this house. And so after February 1865, the Confederate government did not get any products from Penitentiary Mill because of cash-based sales. Why would they do this? Well, of course, they needed the money for the state of Texas, but also something else happened. The Confederacy switched its currency from, like, I guess what they call old issue to new issue, and I don't know a lot about it, but I do know they switched their currency. And the Texas state government said, you bring us in cash new currency and we'll sell to you. If not, no sales to us. So that happened too. And so let's see, we'll go on to the next slide. Okay. So in addition to the high demand for cloth, the mill experienced a lot of difficulties. First of all, the machinery started to depreciate and wear down, deteriorate is the word I was looking for, started to deteriorate as the war went on. And the mill couldn't get replacement parts. So as a result, production dropped off, and the wool produced, the fabrics produced became coarser. And so this was a problem. But the mill was on top of it. And in 1864, they managed to order all new machinery from overseas. The machinery came, the machinery arrived at the mill very early in 65, but by the time they were able to break down the old machines and get the new machines installed, war was over. So that was one thing. The next thing was manpower. You know, you've got the Trans-Mississippi South, which without East Louisiana, you know, Florida parishes and New Orleans and Baton Rouge, I mean, it's just a minuscule population. You just didn't have the manpower to run industry. And so the mill and all industries in the Trans-Mississippi were constantly, you know, vying for qualified labor to run their industries. And the mill, first of all, ran, or it's unskilled labor. It used prison labor. But what did the war do? The war did what all wars do. It drafts all the people who would normally go to prison, you know, puts them in the army. So, you know, so now the prison population is falling off. And, you know, the troublemakers in town, now they're in the infantry regiments, you know, pull a guard duty, they're not in Huntsville prison. So that was one thing. You just really, you had a lack of qualified tradesmen, but at least the Confederacy exempted qualified tradesmen who would work in the mill. It was still a problem, but you could get them exempted. What could not get exempted was you don't just have qualified workers, you have to have qualified management, qualified clerical staff, and the Confederacy would not exempt these people. So this was always a problem. So how was the mill going to work around? Well, I guess you hired your son, you know, to be a clerk, you do that. You know, Besser tried that. But they resorted to using federal prisoners of war. They used hired slave labor. They hired white labor when they could. They used runaway slaves and Confederate military convicts. As one could imagine from this pool of manpower, this isn't the best, quality to go for. According to the mill's superintendent, he said that of the Confederate military convicts, those convicted of minor infractions made excellent workers. They were probably happy to be at the mill instead of, living in a tent somewhere. While those imprisoned for draft dodging, they proved to be poor workers, as one could well imagine. So there were challenges as things went on. So, given that the mill could not meet the demands of the army or the citizenry, the only logical conclusion was that Confederate and state authorities would foster the building of new mills, and indeed they did. The problem with this was very few textile mills were ever truly successful, and when they were, the production was just so low, it was almost inconsequential. So the Confederate government stepped in 1864, and they bought a lot of, or in 1863, and they bought a lot of imported textile machinery. They brought it into the state, and they set up in a place called Mound Prairie, Texas. It's doesn't exist anymore as a city, but it's near Tyler, Texas. And they built the Confederate Government Mill. And they put it into operation in early 1864, and it became the largest textile mill in the Trans-Mississippi. And so it eclipsed the production of the Huntsville Mill. And then when the Huntsville Mill was put out of bounds to the Confederacy because of cash payments, I guess its production kind of offset that loss too. So that was Mound Prairie. And there is actually like a sign for Carver where the mill was. It's now just a peel. So, regarding the mill's woolens, which were used exclusively for outerwear, garments, and uniforms, I think I mentioned that after the 31st of December 1861, the mill stopped furnishing dyed brown woolen cloth to Confederacy, to the military, because they found it was cheaper and quicker, and more efficient just to bleach the yarn and send the woolens out as white. So, you had your Confederates with white uniforms. Up to a certain point, citizens could buy wool privately, that was dyed. But after a point, the mill just went completely with the white stuff. Now, so what I did here is I got some pictures of original Confederate uniforms. They're not, made with penitentiary cloth, but they show kind of what a brown uniform would have looked like, made of penitentiary cloth. And then the other one on your left or on your right, is the sheep's gray. So just examples. And then here's some examples, again, original Confederate uniform, not from Huntsville. I don't think we really have, but one of those uniforms, I'll get to that. But this shows like a white woolen uniform, undyed, kind of yellowish. The next is, cotton jeans. So these are just some examples of what uniforms would look like made of Huntsville hoods. And here, I've got just a few pictures of soldiers who are wearing uniforms that we know were made of Huntsville goods. So here we have soldiers of Company B, the 18th Texas Cavalry, and this is what the Dallas Herald described their uniforms as being. Yellowish gray tunic coat and pantaloons made of penitentiary jeans with 2 rows of brass buttons on the front of the coat and a yellow stripe down the side of her pantaloons. So those are some pictures. Here are some soldiers of the 9th Texas Infantry, which also, their regiments also got Huntsville cloth, a brown cloth early in the war. And so just kind of neat to know that we have some pictures of. And here's some more soldiers that we know are wearing penitentiary cloth. So there are a few pictures out there, but unfortunately there are no surviving uniforms. So anyway, we do have some colorful descriptions of these of uniforms made of this cloth, and I'll share those with you. The most notable is probably not unknown to this group, and that's the 2nd Texas Infantry Regiment. And they had uniforms they wore at Shiloh made out of Huntsville jerseys. So in March of 1862, the Huntsville Mill sent a big consignment of Huntsville cloth to New Orleans right before it fell to the barrels. And the factories there turned it into uniforms. And the regiment's commander, Colonel Moore, recalled on the 1st of April, 1862, the men got their uniforms in Corinth, Mississippi. And he said, when the packages were opened, we found the so-called uniforms as white as washed wool could make them. The men exclaiming, well, I'll be damned, don't them things beat elf? Do the generals expect us to be killed and want us to wear our shrouds? The clothing having no marks as to sizes, articles were issued here as to fit. Soon the company grounds were full of men strutting up and down, some with trousers dragging under their heels, while those of others scarcely reached the top of their socks. Some with jackets so tight they resembled stuffed toads, while others had ample room to carry 3 days' rations in their bussies. The exhibition closed with a swapping scene that reminded one of a horse trading day in a Georgia country town. And only a few days later, the Texans were at Shiloh, and one of their fellow prisoners exclaimed, who were them hellcats that went into battle dressed in their grave clothes? So, a very colorful description of the Huntsville uniforms. We have one other interesting description of what may have been Huntsville cloth. Very likely it was. These were also uniforms made in New Orleans. And so a batch of these uniforms was sent to Ben McCullough's army in northwest Arkansas. 5,000, quote, white Kentucky jeans suits and Osnaburg shirts. And they were issued to the 2nd and 3rd Missouri Infantry Regiment in the Boston Mountain, right before the Battle of Belfort and Tavern. And one of their soldiers described the uniforms as follows. He said, our regiment was uniformed here. The cloth was of rough and coarse texture. The stuff was white, never having been colored, with a goodly supply of grease. The wool had not been purified by any application of water since it was taken from the back of the sheep. In pulling off and putting on the clothes, the olfactories were constantly exercised with a strong odor of that animal. Our brigade was the only body of troops that had these uniforms issued to them, and were often greeted with a chorus of baths. Our clothes, however, were strong and serviceable, if we did look and feel somewhat sheepish in them. And the brigade quartermaster for the Missourians, Captain James Harding, mentioned the jackets and pants were of white linsey with big wooden buttons, were warm, of good material, were uniform in color, and far preferable to no clothes at all. The black belts and equipment set off the linsey very nicely, and the regiment looked really well in their working clothes. So we do have some descriptions. And here's a troop, a soldier at Vicksburg wearing one of these white uniforms. Probably, he's actually a Louisiana soldier. So back to the management of the products. So late 1862, General Theophilus Holmes was commander in the Department of the Trans-Mississippi, and he had his quartermaster officer, Major Burton, negotiate with the Texas governor, Lubbock, to allot to the Army a certain amount. And that's when that allotment that I talked about came about, to where, we really need this much cloth for the Army. And so they worked out kind of a handshake deal for over half the Confederates and 3/4 of the woolens to go to the military. And within 6 months, Burton had received 47,000 yards of woolen cloth, 47,000 yards of cotton jeans, and 96,000 yards of ossuary. And these were all sent to Little Rock, where the department headquarters was, but also where the state of Arkansas had kind of established a big factory using its penitentiary as a base and its industry there. And so that's where they turned this in clothing. So kind of an example for the distribution of the cloth, we have one incident whereby Albert Pike's Indian troops were supposed to have got a consignment of the Huntsville cloth for their uniforms. And this cloth was sent to Monroe, Louisiana, to the depot there, the quartermaster depot. We turned in clothing. But the commander of the 24th Texas got there quicker, and he somehow convinced the quartermaster officer to turn the clothing over to him. So what happened is on 1 November, 18 cases of suits, 6 cases of caps, a case of shirts, and 2 cases of doors were sent to the 24th Texas Cavalry in Arkansas, and it left Albert Pike hopping mad that his troops had been cheated out. But what it tells us is we know that it was all Huntsville Penitentiary cloth that was kind of making its way into the Confederate Army. By February of 1863, General Kirby Smith took over in the Trans-Mississippi. And he kind of reinforced with his new quartermaster officer, William H. Haynes, that they would keep up this kind of handshake deal with the state of Texas for the same amount of Huntsville goods. But the districts of Arkansas and Louisiana were to get priority for use. So all the Huntsville goods would go to Shreveport, Monroe, Little Rock. And of course, San Antonio and Houston would be pretty much cut out of the mix. So it caused a lot of acrimony. Houston and San Antonio got a little bit of Huntsville products, but it also caused them to really pirate off of a lot of the imported stuff, and just a lot of acrimony all around. The thing was, there just wasn't enough to go around for everybody. And here's some pictures of E.C. Morton, the quartermaster in Houston, and Noble Verge, the quartermaster in Shreveport, who, by the way, had a home in Jefferson, Texas. So as mentioned, contractors also got cloth to turn into uniforms, and one of the biggest contractors was James P. Spring. And James P. Spring built a factory here in Huntsville, and he got cloth from the Huntsville mill at no cost, turned it into uniforms, and then shipped all those uniforms to Shreveport, Louisiana, and he charged his price for making the uniforms. He couldn't charge the cost of the cloth. And we have some statistics between April and September of '63. Spring made 28,000 shirts, 24,000 pairs of drawers, 1,600 white kersey jackets, 1,200 pairs of white kersey trousers, 2,000 cotton jeans jackets, and 5,300 pairs of cotton jeans pairs. And these figures of his sales to the Confederate quartermaster match about what the Shreveport Depot was issuing out for the same period. So we have a little bit of information on all that. Now, this example of, this is a real Confederate uniform, real Confederate clothing and all. But we don't have but one maybe on the surviving set of clothes that was made with Huntsville Penitentiary cloth. So I'm showing here, the undyed white Confederate uniforms from elsewhere, in the Confederacy. But you've got an Osnaburg cotton shirt, Osnaburg drawers, and then the white woolen kersey jacket pants. Unfortunately, not from Huntsville, but representative. So people can see what it looked like. Now, there's only one garment surviving that was apparently made of Huntsville Penitentiary cloth. And this jacket is in Confederate Memorial Hall. And so I had the privilege of helping Memorial Hall for a couple of years, work on their accession register and their collection. We went to the top, very familiar with their accession register. And this jacket really didn't have provenance. And then we got an entry for about the kind the jacket would have got there for a donation of a simple jacket from a soldier who had been in Waller's, Texas County. So maybe it's the same garment. This jacket has had its sleeves cut off because soldiers, Confederates, hardly ever got overcoats. So sometimes what they do is they wear two jackets together and maybe cut the sleeves off of one and wear one as the best and put another jacket on top. This is undyed, but it's so dirty. It has so much soil in there, it almost looks like a tan color, but it is undyed. And it's got 7 buttons. So just as guesswork, I'm thinking it was either made by James P. Spring or it was made by Captain Morton in Houston. And it's opened up here. It's got no lining. It's just sewn together with cotton jeans without a lining. So that's the only possible surviving uniform made of Huntsville cloth that I know of. We also have some pictures of trans-Mississippi soldiers who maybe are wearing some Huntsville cloth uniforms. And this is a picture of Company B, 4th Cavalry Regiment of the Arizona Brigade. The picture was taken in late 1863 or early 64. And kind of a neat picture, but the one I really like is this picture of the group of soldiers taken in Washington County, Texas. And the soldiers all had dark, like black citizen pants, but they don't have white penitentiary cloth jackets. So that's really cool. I got this picture with the permission of Larry Roach, who had Military Images magazine. It's now been, there's a new editor, but Larry gave me the permission to use this. And I have searched for years for where this image comes from. It is not from the Texas Heritage Center as it is credited in the magazine. But anyway, it is a picture of soldiers wearing the penitentiary cloth jackets. So that's kind of neat. So as mentioned, the use of Huntsville goods by the Confederate Army continued through 1864, especially in Arkansas and Louisiana. And the mills stopped sales to the Confederate Clothing Bureau in February 1865 due to cash sales. And so we can only assume that the Confederate government used up their remaining stocks and had to rely on the Confederate government mill at Noun Ferry to pick up the slack. So it's ironic that just as the war was ended, the mill installed its new machinery and was ready to start producing at top capacity again. But it was just too late. And likewise, as the chaos of the war's end engulfed the Trans-Mississippi Department, and mobs of citizens everywhere were looting government storehouses. The penitentiary mill suffered a similar fate, and on the 31st of May, 1865, a mob stormed the penitentiary and carried off 54,000 yards of cloth. But it doesn't change the fact that the Huntsville Penitentiary Mill had been the backbone of textile production in the Trans-Mississippi for most of the war. And the Trans-Mississippi would have been hard-pressed to have clothing for its soldiers or its citizens alike without the mill. And that's its size. So thank you. I hope that's good.